It started as an innocent favor. My son in law, Mark, worked as a massage therapist, and when I started complaining about persistent back pain, my daughter suggested I book a session with him. I felt a bit awkward at first, but she insisted. Mark is an absolute professional, she'd said with a smile. I thought it would just be a few sessions, nothing out of the ordinary. But looking back now, I see how life sometimes leads us down paths we'd never expect. When I arrived at his small, cozy studio, the air smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. Mark greeted me with that gentle, steady smile of his, the one that put people at ease, and gestured for me to get ready for the massage. As I prepared myself for the massage, I slipped out of my cardigan and carefully hung it on the chair nearby. The room was quiet, only the faint hum of relaxing music filling the air. And I felt the coolness of the room settle over my skin as I unbuttoned my blouse, folding it neatly alongside my cardigan. Mark had stepped outside to give me a moment of privacy, and I appreciated the chance to compose myself. I smoothed my hair back, feeling the warmth creep into my cheeks as I adjusted the soft towel over my shoulders. As I moved to settle on the massage table, I glanced over my shoulder, and there was Mark, standing by the door, watching me. His gaze was steady, but there was something about it that caught me off guard, as if he had been quietly observing me the entire time. I felt a sudden flush rise in my cheeks, a hint of warmth spreading across my face. I looked away, pretending I hadn't noticed, and lay down, adjusting myself on the table as naturally as possible. I didn't mention it to him, though the thought lingered, leaving me with a strange, thrilling sense of awareness. The first touch of his hands on my back made me tense for a moment, but he had a way of easing into each movement, his fingers firm but comforting. "Just let me know if the pressure's all right," he murmured, his voice low, almost intimate in the quiet of the room. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to sink into the sensation. It had been years since anyone had touched me like that, with such attention and care. His hands were warm, moving deliberately, and I could feel each press, each glide, sinking deeper than just my muscles. I had to steady my breath, not wanting him to notice the effect he was having on me. After that first session, I found myself looking forward to the next. Each time I returned, I felt a little less reserved, letting go of whatever strange awkwardness I'd felt at first. Mark's hands would trace the knots along my back, his fingers gliding gently, each touch a careful, considerate movement. He seemed to know exactly where the pain was, almost as if he could feel it himself. And with every session, I found myself lingering on the way his hands moved over my skin, the warmth of his touch. One evening, as he worked on a particularly tight knot near my shoulder, he paused and asked softly, "Are you all right?" His fingers had just brushed the back of my neck, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I swallowed, my breath catching for a moment, surprised by my own reaction. "Yes," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "It just feels nice. I didn't realize how much I needed this." His hands moved a little slower after that, and there was a subtle shift in the air between us. Something unspoken, something almost magnetic. Neither of us mentioned it, of course, but I could feel the change every time his fingers lingered a little too long, or when his hand brushed against my shoulder. Week by week, our sessions became a quiet, private ritual. I would come in, greet him with a smile that felt softer each time, and he would guide me to the table, his hands warm and firm, grounding me. Every touch became more familiar, every session filled with a delicate tension that neither of us acknowledged, but neither of us seemed willing to let go of either. And yet, there was something in his gaze, in the way his eyes would meet mine when I looked back at him, that told me he felt it too. One evening, as he applied a gentle but firm pressure along my lower back, his hands seemed to pause for just a second longer than usual. I felt the warmth of his fingers seeping into my skin, his touch steady but hesitant, as if he too felt the unspoken closeness that had been building between us. I could sense his gaze on me, and when I looked up, our eyes met. A moment that seemed to stretch on, suspended in the soft dim light. My breath hitched, my heart racing as I looked away, feeling a flush rise in my cheeks. The next week, the air between us felt heavier, filled with an electric tension that neither of us acknowledged. As his hands moved over my shoulders, his fingers brushed along the curve of my neck, and I felt a shiver run through me, each touch feeling more personal, more deliberate. There were times when his fingers would linger just a second too long, his hands grazing my skin with a touch so gentle, it felt like a whisper. Each time, I would find myself holding my breath, waiting, almost hoping for something more, something I couldn't quite name. Then, one afternoon, he worked along the curve of my waist, his touch achingly tender, and I felt his fingers falter, pausing as if caught in hesitation. I looked up, and there he was, his eyes meeting mine, with a look that was both careful and longing, as if he too were caught in this delicate balance between us. My heart raced, my pulse quickening, as I felt the weight of unspoken words, the quiet promise in his gaze. "Is this pressure all right?" he asked, his voice barely a murmur, so soft that it felt like a secret meant only for me. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely holding steady. His hands moved again, tracing along my spine, his fingers a mix of gentle and firm, pressing into every muscle, each touch feeling deeper than the last. Every press of his palm, every gentle sweep of his fingers over my skin, sent my senses spiraling, making it harder and harder to distinguish between the comfort of his touch and the thrill of his closeness. The rhythm of our sessions became something I anticipated with an intensity that surprised me. Each week, he would greet me with that familiar smile, and each time I lay on that table, I could feel his hands moving over my skin with an intimacy that bordered on reverence. The silence in the room would grow thick, each touch lingering just a moment too long. Every shared glance feeling more charged, more daring, and every time, just when it felt as if we were on the verge of something, he would pull back, leaving me with a lingering ache and a soft, unspoken promise hanging in the air between us. Our sessions in his studio became something secret, almost sacred, each one drawing us closer to an invisible edge. After those first few massages, each time I saw him, I felt my pulse quicken, the same tingling anticipation fluttering in my chest. He would welcome me in, the lavender and cedar filling the air, the quiet dimness making every whisper, every touch feel even more intimate. One evening, after my last session with him in the studio, he suggested we meet somewhere else, away from his workspace. The thought thrilled me more than I'd expected, and I agreed, though neither of us spoke of where this might lead. A few days later, when we met again, it was at his house, empty, with my daughter away on a trip. The setting felt strange, familiar, yet foreign. His home usually a space for family gatherings and holidays, but that evening, it transformed, becoming ours in a way I couldn't quite explain. He'd set up a quiet corner with a blanket, candles flickering on the coffee table. The warmth and closeness in that room made everything feel charged, the air between us carrying that same electric tension, heavier now without the formal structure of the studio. As I settled onto the makeshift setup, lying on my stomach as he knelt beside me, the atmosphere felt almost dreamlike. He placed his hands on my shoulders, and this time, he didn't hesitate. His touch felt softer, slower, each movement more deliberate than ever. Every glide of his fingers over my skin seemed to linger, the warmth sinking deeper, filling the space between us. I could feel his breath close to my neck, subtle catch in his inhale as his fingers traced along my shoulder blades, trailing down my back. "Is this all right?" he asked, his voice so soft it was almost a whisper, as though he feared breaking the fragile silence. "Yes," I replied, my voice catching slightly. The word came out barely audible, but it held all the emotions I couldn't bring myself to say. His hands continued, pressing gently, tracing patterns along my lower back, each touch drawing shivers and warmth, filling me with an undeniable ache. I was keenly aware of every place where his fingers brushed against my skin, every soft breath he took as he moved closer. And yet, just like in the studio, he would always pull back, leaving me suspended, holding my breath, each session feeling like a step closer to a boundary neither of us dared cross. The next evening, he invited me back. This time it felt different, more intimate, and neither of us tried to pretend otherwise. I felt his hand linger at my waist, and when our eyes met, there was no mistaking the quiet intensity, the silent understanding we shared. He leaned a bit closer, his hand brushing softly, barely touching, and I felt my heart racing, every nerve alert to the warmth radiating from his touch. It felt as if he was on the verge of saying something, yet held himself back. The moment balanced on the edge of something unspeakably fragile. We continued like this, meeting in quiet secrecy, each encounter layered with an anticipation that left me breathless, a sense of thrill and fear mingling with every touch. He would press his fingers along the curve of my waist, his hand barely grazing me, every move filled with tenderness and a restraint that only heightened the tension. I could feel the weight of every glance, every soft sigh that lingered between us as we shared these hidden moments, a delicate balance of longing and restraint. Each time he leaned in, each time his hand brushed against mine, it felt like a silent confession, one that neither of us dared to voice. And yet, as the evening slipped by, every touch, every lingering gaze brought us closer to that edge, to the unspoken, fragile line we both feared yet couldn't ignore.